What if we are both freed from oppression, but also called to fight oppression? What if? I heard a podcast a while ago. It was about a Holocaust survivor. She was a guest on the podcast. Her name was Rose Schindler. And she talks about her experience in Czechoslovakia growing up in a small village on a farm. And just what a great childhood she had up to a certain point. Things were normal. It was a small village, and they were farmers. They had 8 kids in the family, lived with their aunt. They sold produce. They were just accepted community members. They'd lived in this land for a long time. Till one day, there was a seed planted that they were other, that there was something wrong with them. So she noticed these gradual changes at school. The kids just stopped playing with her. And she was marginalized and bullied. And soon, people stopped buying produce from her dad. And of course, we know what happens, right? The Nazis came in and marginalized them further and took away their business. And they eventually sent them off to a camp that they didn't know where they were going. They put them in a boxcar with no windows. And they were on that car for days, and they got off at a place called Auschwitz. And she recalls that she never saw her parents again, and that when she went back to her village, of the 600 Jews who were there were only 18 that returned. I can't help but think about that story when I think about the Exodus and what we're up against here. That came to my mind reading the Exodus. A people who had been living in peace and harmony in a land for generations, hundreds of years, 400 years in Egypt. Friends and family. I mean, they probably couldn't even remember a time when they didn't live in Egypt. That's longer than any of us have been in Canada unless we're Indigenous and have Indigenous family. That's how long they'd been in Egypt. It was home. And yet now we read that there is a new king, a new pharaoh in the land, and he sees the Israelites as a serious problem. He's afraid of them. They're outsiders, immigrants, foreigners. They don't belong. That, I think, is the face of oppression. Oppression always starts with some kind of fear. Fear is the road to oppression. And then dehumanization and the stripping of humanity from people. This is the first in our series through Exodus, and our series is called Inflation, the Cost of Freedom, because freedom just seems to cost more and more as we go through the book of Exodus. And I think it's really important to note that this first chapter is a direct continuation of where we left off in the previous page in Genesis. It's a direct continuation. We end with the death of Joseph. In Genesis chapter 50, verse 26. This is what it says. So Joseph died at the age of 110. And after they embalmed him, he was placed in a coffin in Egypt. Exodus picks up as the next chapter in a book, almost like the next season in a TV series. The very next scene is Exodus. And there's a small word, it's hard to tell in our translations, but it actually starts with the word and. Joseph's in a coffin in Egypt, and this happens. It's a direct continuation with the previous chapter. It's connected to all the blessings and promises and hopes that was given to the people of Israel and all of the provisions of Genesis. And these are the names of the generations who lived in Egypt. Now this is significant because the promises were made to Abraham, Isaac, Joseph, and Jacob. Promises of peoplehood and land. To create a people for his name, for redemptive purposes, to be a blessing to all nations, for freedom to captives, for everybody. Yet the promise hasn't happened. They're now Egyptians almost, for all intents and purposes. They've lived there for hundreds of years. Who even remembers the promise? Who even remembers Joseph? That was then. In verse 6, that whole book, that whole generation, all those lives and drama, all that story is set aside with these words. All that generation died. Kind of sad, really. I was getting attached to those people. All that generation died. That's what they get. And I think it's really important to know that the driving force of the book of Exodus is introduced as connected to Genesis. The hinge verse is verse 8. And this is what it says. This is verse 8. Then a new king, to whom Joseph meant nothing, came to power in Egypt. A new king came to power. So remember, the book, hint, the book of Exodus means departure. What's going to happen, I wonder? When we turn to Exodus 1, it feels like things have really come off the rails a little bit for the Israelites. Really just gone sideways. This new king, this new Pharaoh, most think he was Ramses II in the 13th century BC, doesn't even remember Joseph. And I feel like that's kind of weird. He might have had some kind of education as a king, as a pharaoh. He wouldn't have heard of Joseph, who rescued the land. It's kind of weird. Joseph was legendary to the Egyptians. He was either ignorant of his own nation's history, or he turned a blind eye to it, willfully forgetting. Ignored the history of Joseph's wise counsel and how the Egyptians benefited from all that Joseph did. Just pages in the Bible anyway, just a short while ago, chapter 41 of Genesis. Just a little while ago. He doesn't like what he sees when he looks and sees the Israelites, the descendants of Joseph. He sees outsiders. He sees people who are different, people who do not belong, people who are not welcome. They are other, and he fears that. You can almost feel the fear driving this king. What if? What if they decide to turn on us? What if they join our enemies and try to overthrow us? What if their culture overpowers our culture? What if? You know, that's often a question that drives us down the road of fear. Once we take that road, there aren't many off-ramps. He asks a question, a fear-based question. What if they become more numerous than us? What if they join our enemies? What if they fight against us? What if? It's that same us and them thinking that I think continues to plague the world today. We also divide people into categories. I find myself doing that even though I don't want to. Sounds familiar, doesn't it? What if they become powerful? We should send them back. What if they join our enemies? We shouldn't let them in. What if they overpower us? We should keep them powerless. Us and them. The others. It's not so different. It's based on fear, and fear predictably always leads to oppression of some sort, of some type. That is happening here in Egypt. Pharaoh is afraid, so he justifies, he dehumanizes, and he oppresses. Pharaoh and his advisors make up a clever plan to keep these people down. Those people who aren't real Egyptians. Those people who look different and talk different and behave and believe differently. To justify, to dehumanize, to oppress them. They come up with a plan. It's a great plan if you're a tyrant. Because what do you do when you want to disempower a whole group of people? You have a lot of things to get done. Why? Slavery, that's a good idea. Let's try slavery and strip them of their humanity. That'll work. It turns out to be a great win-win for the oppressor because you keep people down and you get rich. This is what happened, verse 11. So they put slave masters over them to oppress them with forced labor, and they built Pithom and Ramesses as store cities for Pharaoh. They were afraid. They were afraid of them, so they reacted and they made them slaves. I think it's important to be aware that there were different kind of slaves in Egypt. It might not be quite what we think of when we hear the term slavery. There were bond slaves. Now, this is what happens if you run out of money. You can sell yourself to get some money. And you can sell your family too. Now, I don't know if you could sell your family, not yourself. I'm not sure all the details. Not sure what would happen if they didn't like that. I'm not sure. But you could do that. You could sell yourself to pay off debts. There were chattel slaves. These were captives of wars that had no rights. They were taken from other countries and brought to the country. And then there were forced labor slaves, which were a type of slaves, but it was a bit different. It was like they drafted the population to get state projects done. Like if you have the Olympics coming up, you just draft people to build it, or you need a highway. You just draft people, regular people, everyone in the population gets drafted. The job's done, they go back. They get a little bit of a wage. It's like taxation. Everyone has to do it. This is what form of slavery they put the Israelites under. It was forced labor. But it wasn't just that, it was crushing labor. It was probably unfair wages. And it was probably a harder workload than normal to drive them down, to dehumanize them. Also, I think they were insulting projects for the Israelites. These two locations, Pithom and Ramesses, were in the land of Goshen. The land of Goshen was the land that Pharaoh, the good Pharaoh, gave to Joseph and his descendants. It was the best land of Egypt. So that was their land. And now they're slaves in their own land, building these storehouses and military garrisons for the Egyptian oppressors. It must have been really humiliating. So there were slaves to these symbols, building these symbols of imperial power, where they had been for generations and generations. Hundreds of years in Egypt. This is a complete turnaround. And as a result of Pharaoh going down that what if road, that road of fear that leads to oppression. Now, oppression in all of its forms is evil. There's no question about that. Oppression is a complex evil, though. It can be psychological, spiritual, economic, political. It has consequences in all those realms. And often the results of oppression are that people are left defenseless, and sometimes they don't even know they're being oppressed. It is evil in all of its forms. The book of Exodus is about departure from oppression and God's role in that departure, his active, personal, invested role. God has always been, is, and always will be on the side of those who are oppressed. He stands against the oppressors. And couldn't we say that God's intervention, not just in Egypt, but in Jesus, is about God's stand against oppression in all of its forms? The person of Jesus came to set captives free. Now, many evangelicals, which I still call myself and I don't, I'm not sure where I am with that term, I'm wrestling with that because I like some of it I don't. Some of it scares me, some of it I like. Historically I like it, some of it not that. So I'm a bit confused. Maybe you are. Many evangelicals tend to spiritualize this clear biblical reference to social and economic oppression as a spiritual oppression. It's all symbolic of spiritual stuff. The Exodus story is about spiritual oppression. It's symbolic. Yet God is continually portrayed as a defender and refuge of the oppressed. There is a spiritual and physical or tangible result of oppressions. Just as freedom from oppression is both spiritual and tangible. It's both. Egypt oppresses the Israelites. So this is what happens. The more burdened the Israelites become, the harder the task, the meaner the slaves get, the more babies they have. It's kind of weird. They just seem to flourish. It's puzzling and troubling to the Egyptians. It's like trying to put out a fire and they're throwing oil on it. It just keeps getting bigger and bigger and bigger. This is Exodus 12, the first part. But the more they were oppressed, the more they multiplied and spread. We should stop and pause and ask, why? Why would ruthless forced labor make them spread, multiply, and become even more powerful than they were before? Why? Was it because they got pumped up from doing all the labor? They really jacked from lifting all the bricks and they just became like Conan, the barbarian? You know, you guys know Conan's wheel, right? Come on, Conan? Anyway, we'll do a series on Conan some other day. Were they so angry they just started making babies? Was there something in the water? Why would they multiply like this? The Egyptians can't figure it out. And it infuriates them. They feared them even more. They dreaded them. This is what the second half of Exodus 12 to 14 says. So the Egyptians came to dread the Israelites and worked them ruthlessly. They made their lives bitter with harsh labor in brick and mortar and with all kinds of work in the fields. In all their harsh labor, the Egyptians worked them ruthlessly. Yet, they continued to flourish. Why? It's puzzling. There's a particular word used in verse 12 that we need to be attentive to. It's a flag waving for the reader. It's like, it should be in red, but that's saved for something else. Anyway, it says, they multiplied. Does it remind you of something? There's a blessing earlier in Genesis. Be fruitful and multiply. Genesis 1:28, Genesis 9:1, to Adam and Eve and to Noah, be fruitful and multiply. It's an allusion directly to that. It's that language that draws our attention to the blessing of Abraham and Isaac and Joseph and Jacob, that generation that had passed. You are blessed to be a blessing. Your numbers will be more numerous than the stars and sands on the beach. I will be your God, and you will be my people. Through you, all people will be blessed. And God's blessing won't be stopped. Not by all the labor forces in the world, not by all the pharaohs in the world, not by any that try to keep them down. Pharaoh's oppression is an illustration, an opportunity to contrast the power of God's blessing on his people with the oppression of the world, and it will not be stopped. God's blessing will not be stopped. It's like a tide coming and you can't stop it. Or more close to home, it's like a snowstorm that you can't shovel out of. You can't stop it. Pharaoh's power could not stand against God's blessing, so they multiplied. It's a sign that God is still with them. I wonder if God is the same today. Does he still have a heart for the oppressed? Does Jesus have a heart for the oppressed? can the powers and principalities of this world stand against the blessings for us today? I will be your God, you will be my people. Are we blessed? Can we find ourselves in this story? What's the word for us today? Do we align ourselves with the Israelites or with Pharaoh? Oh, that's uncomfortable. Do we align ourselves as victims of oppression or as the oppressors? And I wonder, as I reflect, I wonder if it's useful to understand ourselves as both. Because there is no doubt that Jesus frees us from our chains as prisoners, as the oppressed. That's what salvation is about. It's the freedom from bondage by grace through faith. But Jesus also had words for his disciples who were so quick to jump out of those chains, they forgot about the chains of other people. So their freedom became a privilege to be hoarded, not a blessing to be shared. It's the same prophetic word that Israel heard again and again and again from the prophets when they were in sin. You were blessed to be a blessing, not to hoard it to yourselves. We are blessed to be a blessing. Jesus is concerned about oppression of all kinds. This is how Jesus started his ministry in Luke. After his temptation in the wilderness, he went into the synagogue on the Sabbath and picked up a scroll and read it. This is Luke chapter 4, verses 18-20. This is what Jesus said to all those teachers of the law. The Spirit of the Lord is on me because he has anointed me to proclaim good news to the poor. He sent me to proclaim freedom for the prisoners and recovery of sight for the blind, to set the oppressed free, to proclaim the year of the Lord's favor. Then he rolled up the scroll, gave it back to the attendant, and sat down. The eyes of everyone on the synagogue were fastened on him. He began by saying to them, "Today the scripture is fulfilled in your hearing." Mic drop. It's me. Jesus, that is. Not to be clear. He aligned himself with God and God's agenda to set the oppressed free. That's what Jesus is about. And I really think Jesus' disciples are concerned about oppression. That's who we are as well. The Sermon on the Mount beside the blessed are those who are oppressed. That's who the blessed are. The blessed are those who are oppressed. It's not blessed to have all the power. It's not blessed are those who have everything. It's not blessed are those who have privilege. Blessed are the poor. Blessed are the marginalized. Blessed are the weak. Blessed are the oppressed. And Jesus displayed this care and concern in his ministry, standing with the weak and oppressed, not the powerful. Actually opposing the powerful, those with privilege and with status. Now, it's interesting, a historical survey of this Exodus passage and thoughts about it and the scriptures about oppression. Many evangelicals have tended to spiritualize the Exodus like it's an illustration of our journey to heaven, dismissing clear biblical images and references to social and economic oppression as metaphors for spiritual oppression. It's this split between the spiritual world and the physical world, as if you can break those two things apart. It's artificial and doesn't measure up, because in the Bible, God is continually portrayed as defender and refuge of the oppressed. I believe God calls us to be concerned for the oppressed, deeply concerned. So much so that I believe that only those who side with the oppressed are able to do authentic theology and identify with the God of the oppressed. It's a real Kleenex day today. And I find that I've moved beyond having fear of blowing my nose to having fear of blowing my nose. There's a theologian, his name is James Cone. He's a liberation theologian. Studies what's called black theology. He's a black theologian, not because he's black, but he is, but because he's a black theologian. Does that make sense? Okay. Liberation theology, James Cone. This stream of theology came out of African Americans who have generations of slavery and are looking at the gospel in a way that ties into oppression and physical release of oppression. And he says something that I resonate with. To know Jesus is to know him as revealed in the struggle of the oppressed for freedom. Let me read that again. To know Jesus is to know him as revealed in the struggle of the oppressed for freedom. Now, I find that I resonate with that. How can you claim to follow a God who is for the oppressed if you don't carry his burden for the oppressed? Now, it seems fitting to be going through the Bible and seeing what Jesus says about oppression and fear and what the gospel says to us about love and peace and freedom from captivity. Because we live in times where fear is everywhere. It's magnified. We see the news from all over the world. We have access to it all the time. If there's a breaking news headline, our phones vibrate in our pockets and we look at it. Instantly, we know what's going on. Every tragedy, every bad thing we see, fear is magnified, amplifying our sense of danger, where previously we might read the newspaper once a day if we were really into newspapers. We are colliding with people who are other in this global village that we call the world, people that we consider other because the world is getting smaller. And right here in Kelowna, in Canada, facing a choice of welcoming refugees or fearing refugees and outcasts, people with no homes. We read things about people who think differently than us, politics that divide, perspectives on the environment that divide us, medical debates that destroy relationships, not to mention wars that are hurting people on both the side of the aggressor and the defender. Seems to me a timely word and reminder that God is for the oppressed. And we, as his people, need to resist the slippery slope of fear that causes us to see people as other, as concepts, as threats, as competition, as less than. God is a God who is a champion of the oppressed. What if? Fear can drive us back to ask these what-if questions. These fear-based what-if questions that lead to oppression. Yet aren't we, as disciples of Jesus, in the process of overcoming fear? 2 Timothy 1:7 says, "For God has not given us a spirit of fear and timidity, but of power, love, and self-discipline." Because of that spirit, what-if questions lead to possibility. They lead to hope. They lead to freedom. What if we are freed from the fear in our own lives that causes us to see things and fear things we don't understand? What if we weren't just waiting to escape this world and go to heaven, but saw ourselves as ambassadors of the kingdom of God in the here and now? What if we were God's hands and feet in the world, his body in the world? What if we welcomed the stranger? What if we saw the humanity of others? What if we shared God's heart for the oppressed? What if? What if? What if? I think we would be fruitful and multiply. because nothing can stand against God's promises. Nothing.